Have you no shame?
No, not at all.
I'm sorry, I'm really focused on getting this Bible thing going. I apologize. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just working. Okay, we are live. So whatever you're doing is what we're doing. I'm currently I'm not too happy about it. A lot of electronics right there. That thing hanging by that HDMI, I don't like that. Can you tuck it in something? Can you tuck it right here? We got enough length? Take them off when I get in close.
How are you? I'm good. How are you doing? Great. Great.
Is that even legal though? I mean, for you to run?
Now you look like real McCoy. Why not? I lived there for 46 months.
And there was
Walter, I'm working.
I'd like to call this author event to order. This is a very unusual occasion to have an author here, co-author with Michelle Malkin. It's called Sold Out. I love the subtitle, How High-Tech Billionaires and Bipartisan Beltway Crapweasels Are Screwing America's Best and Brightest Workers. So that's the book. This was done in 2015, a little less than 3 years ago. And Simon & Schuster's publisher. This is the paperback edition. I just want to make 3 or 4 announcements and comments before we start. I'll make this brief. This is intended to be a fairly small, intimate, private group. And the reason for that is we are actually video streaming. So this is going all over everywhere. I guess you could say the world. And there are some organizations that have put this out, so there's a lot of people watching this. So that means that you need to be as quiet as possible, and we're going to keep our parrot shut up during this entire meeting. We have somebody in there guarding him so he doesn't disrupt the video stream in New Jersey somewhere. Right. And what we're going to do, and Doug Bassler and Tiger are handling the technical side. The second thing I want to say is that we had an event last night in Gowan Hall at the University of Washington. We had some students there, some members of the public. Hi, Lori. Come on in. And so this is a repeat performance, and we also did the video streaming at that event. So he's going, John Miano is going to do 2 segments tonight, and then Kevin Lynn, who is here, who belongs to an organization, now you got to listen to this twice, Progressives for Immigration Reform, is going to take a little different tact, and he's going to be speaking in between. He's like a sandwich. He's going to be the in-between guy doing this. And this issue really is not a partisan issue. This is a serious issue affecting American jobs. I will make one prediction, and this is the last thing I will say before I make the introduction. If you don't walk out of this room tonight shaking your head, either frustrated or angry or just in disbelief, I will be surprised. This is a prime example of the United States Congress passing a law or laws that just get out of control, and the very people who create the problems are the ones that are supposed to fix the problems, and they just never do it. And it affects a lot of American lives. And it's very hard to get this message out. This is not a sexy topic, you know, like guns or that sort of thing. It's hard to get the message out because the mainstream media doesn't want to cover it. It's not politically correct because you'd be called a racist for just discussing it. A second reason is tech workers are very hard to organize. They just don't think that way, and so there's no fighting back, so to speak. And so John Miano is going to get into these issues, and let me introduce him very briefly. John actually is a software architect. That's his chosen profession, and he went back to law school late in life because he became so frustrated, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his personal story about what was happening to the job situation with all these foreign guest workers coming into the United States. And so he's going to spend the first segment talking a lot about that. And then he's also going to give you a history primarily from 1990. And really from 1990 to now, it does go back before that, but primarily from 1990 to now, this law, it's not the only thing, it's just a piece. This partially sowed the seeds to get President Trump elected of this kind of thing. Americans maybe couldn't articulate it, but they knew something crazy, weird, and bad was going on. And this is a pretty good example of it. So John comes to us from New Jersey. He is one of the leading experts in the United States on H-1B visas. And not from Microsoft's point of view, but from the other point of view. He has written multiple programming books, has a degree in mathematics from the University of Worcester in Ohio, and he has a JD from Seton Hall in New Jersey. The only book that he has written outside of the programming area is this book called Sold Out. He's testified in front of Congress numerous times. He's not particularly liked by Microsoft or Amazon, and he's not a great fan of Bill Gates, our icon out here. He's been quoted in many national media outlets, USA Today, New York Times, and so forth, been on a number of cable shows, quoted in major newspapers. I could go on and on. Let's give John Miano a great hand and let's him welcome him.
Well, thanks for that introduction. This is supposed to be an author chat. So last night we did a formal presentation. Today we're going to chat, and we probably can take questions as we go on if we have them. And I just have notes that I'm going to go on. I'm not going to, not a great script. But I mean, the starting point of where this issue has gotten attention recently was Disney. The New York Times had reported that Disney fired 250 American computer programmers down in Orlando, and then had them train their foreign replacements using the H-1B visa program. You may have just heard the news now is that all the lawsuits in regard to that have been ended, that because what Disney did is perfectly legal. It is legal to replace Americans with H-1B workers. So, and the Disney thing actually occurred while we were writing the book, so it was kind of timely to promote the book, but it happened while we were doing things. So, we'll start with a little bit of a history of immigration law in the United States. And then I'm going to go to my personal story here. The current immigration system started in 1952. We passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which created the current immigration system. And in that act, Congress got rid of everything that existed before and then created an entirely new system. So it was comprehensive immigration reform as how the term is in literal English, as opposed to what we call comprehensive immigration reform now, which is just make the system more complicated to benefit lawyers. In the Immigration Act of 1952, there were two guest worker visas. It was called the H-1 visa and the H-2 visa. Okay. The H-1 visa was for people of distinguished ability. So the expectation this was going to be like Nobel Prize winners, distinguished researchers, and that kind of thing. And H-2 was absolutely everything else. And what happened to derail the system is a common problem we'll be talking about more in the second half presentation, is administrative abuse. Because under the H-1 program, there were no protections for American workers. As Congress, they documented in their reports that it didn't make any sense to have protection for American workers when we're inviting researchers and Nobel Prize winners and that type of person. So the H-1 visa had no protections for American workers. What the INS started doing was treating anyone in a profession as having distinguished ability. So basically, engineers, computer programmers were being admitted under the H-1 program when they should have been required to go through the H-2 program, which actually had stronger protections than any of the current visas. So that brings us, we'll now skip from 1952 all the way to 1990, which we can skip all the other things. And in 1990, we had the Immigration Act of 1990, which is, when you hear people talk about our broken immigration system, the Immigration Act of 1990 was largely responsible for breaking it. That was the act that created the H-1B visa. That was supposed to deal with this problem of people coming on H-2, going on H-1 visas when they were supposed to come on H-2 visas. But rather than taking the normal rational step of just redefining what distinguished ability meant and clarifying it so that the INS couldn't be just letting computer programmers come in without any worker protections, the Immigration Act of 1990 just made a complete tangle of the immigration system and created the H-1B visa for specialty occupations, which means anything that requires a college degree. And so you have to have it, so that can cover a wide variety, computer programmers, physical therapists, all kinds of things like that. But things became much more complicated. We created visa categories for all kinds of different purposes in that act. And so it had the main effect of creating jobs for immigration lawyers. Okay. So after creating this visa and making things much more complicated in 1990, in 1994, the AIG in New Jersey, near where I live, and Sealand became the first to use the H-1B program to replace American workers. They contracted foreign vendors to bring in H-1B workers into the United States, and they had them. At AIG, they fired 250 Americans and replaced them with H-1B workers, and at Sealand, they fired 350 Americans and replaced them with H-1B workers. Okay, and what they did is by using an intermediary. Like AIG used a company called Syntel to supply the workers. AIG could say, well, we didn't get any H-1B visas. Syntel could say, we didn't fire any Americans, so the law wasn't broken. And they exposed a gaping loophole in the law in regard to H-1B. And so that's when I got involved in all this. I wasn't one of those people, but I was in the area and I was a computer consultant at the time. And having that many people dropped in the job market was devastating the job market. My next door neighbor was one of the people who was replaced at Sealand. Okay. So from then on, I started following this issue and researching it because I was under the impression, probably like most Americans, that don't you have to show you couldn't find an American worker before I get a foreign worker? And so I started going through the statutes and reading them, and realized, no, you don't. Okay? That's a complete falsehood, even though it's repeated over and over in the media. couple of years later, I actually was a consultant then at AIG, that AIG had expected they were going to save lots of money by using these foreign workers. Turned out that was not the case, and they had to hire a lot of people like myself to clean up the resulting mess. So basically 250 people lost their jobs for nothing. I was looking at this stuff, that the workers that they imported from these, in particular at AIG it was from India, from Sealand it was the Philippines, but the workers they imported were of very poor quality, and they completely made a mess out of AIG's computer systems. So now, about 2 years later, we came to 1998. In 1998, what started happening is originally Congress imposed a quota of 65,000 visas a year on H-1B. Okay? One of the expectations in the Immigration Act of 1990 was that reliance on guest worker usage would be reduced, which was one of the great failures of the system. And so by 1998, employers, having learned they could replace Americans with these workers, were using up the quotas. Okay. And so the House Judiciary Committee passed a 21-page bill that temporarily increased the number of H-1B visas, but it also banned replacing Americans with H-1B workers. So at the time, I was thinking, that seems like a legitimate compromise. We can increase the number of visas, but not allow them to replace Americans with foreign workers. Well, the tech industry had different ideas. They screamed that they would rather have no increase in H-1B visas if they couldn't replace Americans with foreign workers. They literally were saying that. I remember one industry lobbyist, later turned community organizer, later turned failed Senate candidate, saying, "Over my dead body will this pass." And what the Republican leadership in the House, this is Dick Armey, Newt Gingrich, and Spencer Abraham did, is they replaced the committee-passed bill at 21 pages with a 42-page bill written by industry lobbyists. Okay. This bill explicitly made it legal to replace Americans workers with these H-1B workers, and it allowed the employers to charge damages to H-1B workers if they quit. Okay. So it was a complete give industry whatever they wanted. And it was shocking to me, and as following this is going on, that you learn in school about bills starting out in committee and then working their way for the House. I'd never been told about the part where the industry lobbyists rewrite the bill before it goes to a vote. And so then it comes to a vote. It was a night that the House leadership told the members that all the votes were done and they could go home. And so very few people were apparently there. It was done in a voice vote. So we have no idea who even voted for it, let alone who voted which way. We don't know who was there, what happened. Well, there was one last hope for labor. Bill Clinton had promised organized labor that he would veto this bill because it was so bad. But the tech industry had the easy solution for that, which you can probably guess. They threw a fundraiser for Bill Clinton at the home of John Doerr in California. 2 days before Bill Clinton collected his bribe, he announced he was flip-flopping, and that becomes law. So that is how it became legal to replace Americans with H-1B workers. And by this time, I'm completely sick of what's going on. And then by 2000, I was working as a consultant at Dun & Bradstreet, and I was in the midst of them giving the H-1 boot to their computer programmers. So they're firing at people. And because I'm an outsider, I'm an observer watching this. In fact, I met one guy who had gotten the H-1 boot at AIG, then gone to Dun & Bradstreet and was getting replaced there as well. Okay. The other thing that was changing by that time is that when the AIG incident happened, there was a lot of media attention. Okay. 2020, 60 Minutes did segments on it, but that all dried up. By 2000, the media wasn't even covering these things. It's like Dun & Bradstreet got some coverage in local media, but that was about it. And 2001, I got the opportunity to go to law school, and I hadn't really planned on going to law school. If someone in 1999 said, "You're going to go to law school," I would have said, "You're crazy." But in 2001, I'm looking what's going on. All the Americans around me are being replaced by foreign workers. What's the future here? So I decided to go to law school, and then I graduated and I started working to fight against this type of thing. I testified for Congress several times after law school. In fact, I testified for Congress, I think once or twice before law school. I think it was once, but it might have been once or twice before law school. And then as I was working on this, I was saying, we've got to document what's going on, because what's going on here is just so outrageous. The Congress is just completely out of control. They're not working for the American people. And so I started working on a book on this H-1B stuff and the abuse of these visas. At the same time, I had known Michelle Malkin since about 2000. And then at the same time, a friend of ours, Peter Brimmello, said, Michelle's working on the same thing. And so we came together, and that's how we started working on the book and going back and forth on it. And I got to say, it was a great experience being able to work with Michelle Malkin. She's really is a great person. She's the sort of person that you could do business with without doing a paper contract. You could just talk. Her word is her bond. You can just talk to her, and she really was great to work with. And I think you'll read the book. It's kind of mixed. It's a mixture of yes, and I think if you read carefully, you can probably tell who wrote which sections of the book. I'm not exaggerating that, but it might be more apparent to me who wrote what. But I probably think that if the readers do, because generally I'm probably more analytical, and Michelle is bashing people over the. But she never mashes anyone over the head who doesn't deserve it. Yeah. That's the great thing. And so the book came out. And it was interesting when the book came out, it kind of hit sort of at the right time, because that was when Donald Trump started raising this issue in the campaign. And it's interesting because the American media always tries to sell the narrative that immigration is a losing issue at the ballot box. And the reality is, when you look around at the races, I see it as always being a winning issue at the ballot box. Just that people are afraid to touch it because of the media. And Trump showed that immigration was a winning issue at the ballot box. And so we're now kind of waiting to see what Trump will do. The president is somewhat limited because he can only affect regulation. There are some things that he could do to touch on the edges of these various programs, but he's limited by Congress. And unfortunately, we're seeing Congress is not moving in the right direction. Senator Flake and Senator Hatch, for example, they responded to Trump winning on cutting back on H-1B visas by introducing legislation for unlimited H-1B visas. In the House, the only bill that's moving forward is one from Darrell Issa that does absolutely nothing. It's a bill so the House can push forth, so the House can say, hey, see, we enacted H-1B reform to the public, while telling their donors that see, we didn't do anything. We didn't affect you. And so the main thing you need to keep in mind, well, two things. In the H-1B itself, the very purpose of the H-1B program is to replace Americans with foreign workers. I left out one piece of history in my narrative. In 2000, one of the requirements of the H-1B program is that you have to pay the worker at least a prevailing wage. 2004, Congress changed the law so that employers can claim the prevailing wage for H-1B is the 17th percentile. So we're talking the bottom sixth, okay? So we have a program. So Congress has explicitly created a program for replacing Americans with foreign workers who are cheap foreign workers. And that's the very purpose of the program. And what Congress likes to do is mislead by saying that this is a program for high-skilled workers who are filling jobs that Americans can't fill. And it's basically a misdirection that's going on here. So that's my history, the brief history. We got a long one. I hope you're a little upset. We could take any questions if you want before our can we go to the next section? I do get to tell you a little bit more about what's going on a little later, because H-1B is just the tip of the iceberg of these programs. What's going on? It's the best known.
Okay, let's take some questions now, and Lori, you want to start?
What was the impetus in 1952? Was it the agriculture industry?
It was I think the post-war, okay, because they had the people coming, wanting to flee the ravages of the war coming to the United States. So that was the impetus for doing a complete revision of the immigration system.
Dale.
In not exact numbers, but in a general sense, how many immigrants have come to the United States, in the 50s, in the 60s, and 80s, 90s? I mean, I know the trend has gone up, but, roughly where did we start in the 50s and where are we now?
Unfortunately, that's kind of outside my area. I wish I have other people at the Center for Immigration Studies know that type of stuff well, because it's outside the guest worker. It's, more people we have more immigrants coming to the U.S. now than any point in U.S. history. It is larger. And that is largely due to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that's created that section. Plus the Immigration Act of 1990 expanded it further, too.
All right. Walter.
So is a spouse of an H-1B worker eligible to work?
Oh, that's another lawsuit I'm involved in. Under the statute, no. But President Obama, and one of the things I mentioned was administrative abuse, and this is a topic we're going into the second part after my break. But one of the things that has happened over the years is that, in addition to Congress authorizing foreign labor, the executive has been doing it through regulation. Okay? Allowing for it. And historically, this had been done under the covers. You do little bits here and there, and if you're called on the legality of it, they would do a song and a dance, and never really give an explanation why they were doing that. Under the Bush administration, we saw a big expansion of that, and then under the Obama administration, Obama claimed that he had the authority to allow absolutely any alien to work in the United States. Okay? That meant if the alien is in the United States legally, but not without a work authorization, the president can authorize them. If the alien is in the United States illegally, I can authorize them. That was DACA, DAPA, and I could admit people into the United States without a visa through regulation and allow them to work. And so that's an issue being litigated. And one of those actions was to allow the spouses of H-1B workers to work as well. So we challenged that in court. There was a group of people who at Southern California Edison who were fired and replaced by H-1B workers, formed a group called Save Jobs USA, and they sued to challenge those regulations, and the court held that they did not have standing, okay, which is a topic we'll discuss in the next part, and dismissed the case. However, we appealed the case, and I think everyone at DOJ knows that the dismissal on standing is not going to hold. And so rather than suffer a defeat on the merits, DOJ has announced that they're going to rescind the regulations allowing spouses to work. And they've asked the court, and the court has granted a delay in the case. So the case has been in abeyance for since a year ago, last February or January, I think it is. So it's been over a year sitting waiting for them. So when the time of the abeyance expires, we keep on going to the court. Come on, decide the case. And DOJ goes to the court and says, no, we'll delay it. And the response to the courts has been to delay. Which we'll talk about. The delay is a big thing in the courts.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
Dio and then Joe.
So, hi John, Dio here. I'm curious, what things do you think President Trump has done well in regards to the program, and what things do you think he should do going forward?
Well, the first thing he's done is applied some scrutiny to the visa process. The visa process had been a rubber stamp affair. So let me give the example that there's something called premium processing of visas. For an additional fee, you can pay for premium visa processing, which I believe it has to be done in 15, that it guarantees they'll process the visa within 15 days. Now, at the same time, we have a lottery for the H-1B visas. The demand is so high that they use the quota up in the first day. Okay? So about 60% of the visa petitions came in with premium processing historically. So you're talking about getting about 65,000 visa petitions that had to be processed within 15 days. And that had been going on for years, which means it was entirely a rubber stamp process. Okay? The Trump administration has applied scrutiny to these visas. For example, they've suspended this premium processing during the peak seasons. Right. So that's the first thing that they've done. And this has caused great panic because people are saying, that it's unprecedented that any scrutiny is being applied to it and it's being treated as if it's a great catastrophe. In reality, all Trump is doing in this regard is what government audits have called for decades to be done that have been routinely ignored. So we're hoping, so that's the main thing that has happened now. The other thing that we're hoping is there'll be regulations that come out, and there are a few things that can be done. We would hope that there could be a better definition of what an employer is. Because right now, the main use of H-1B visas is what we call body shopping. They get imported by companies that just distribute them to other companies. So that means the workers can't possibly be filling jobs that where Americans aren't available. They're actually actively competing with Americans in the job market. So we'd hope to see a change in the definition of what an employer is. Another one that I'm hoping for is that they'll shorten the duration of H-1B from 6 years to 3 years, say. The duration of H-1B visas are set by regulation. Congress has set a maximum of 6 years, but otherwise it's 3 years. So we're waiting anxiously, but we haven't yet seen the real action yet. Okay, so it's we trust but verify at this point with Trump.
Okay, Joe, you're next, and then Chris. We talk a lot about illegal aliens or undocumented workers, if we're being more politically correct. But you're describing documented workers with scant justification. I don't know, there's got to be a catchphrase for it, crap weasel I love, but but they're not the crap weasels, And your first question, early question, was how many are there? So this problem probably dwarfs all of the illegal aliens that get all the press.
It might as far as legal guest worker, and these are what we call non-immigrants. Although it's kind of, H-1B is kind of a mixture of immigrant and non-immigrant. There are about 1.3 million a year people entering the workforce under statute, and over 2 million a year entering the workforce through regulation. So I said that there are
3.3.
So it's about 3 of people entering the workforce each year.
Are they ever eligible to vote?
If they get citizenship, they can. One of the problems that happened with H-1B is that when I told about the H-1 and H-2 visas, they were strictly non-immigrant visas, okay? Which meant that you had to maintain a foreign residence, and so you couldn't normally apply for a green card. You could in some circumstances, but that was not a normal process. In Congress's infinite stupidity in 1990, they made the L visa and H-1B visa have dual intent, so that you can apply for a green card on H-1B visa, which then undermined the goal of reducing guest worker usage, because the logic that they used in the 1990 Act is they doubled the number of green cards, so that employers would have the choice to hire a person on a green card rather than H-1B visa. But by allowing people on H-1B visa to apply for green cards, the green cards became an inducement for people to become guest workers, and the employers had no incentive to get the green cards, to hire people on green cards. So we have this giant mess. It's a big mess.
Chris.
Here's the thing. I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but there are guest workers, their spouses, they're living here, and they're having babies. So what they're doing, they're dropping anchor babies to stay in this country. I know for a fact, I'm covering my face because I don't want to be on camera. So I know for a fact that I've seen people at Microsoft that are from India, and their spouses are here, and they get pregnant, and boom, the kid automatically becomes the 18th Amendment, so to speak. And that's the problem. That has to stop.
Well, the thing that I would say is I think the shortening the duration of the visa would help on that. You know, that, I mean, 6 years is, 6 years is not a guest worker. You know, that's way too long for a person supposedly filling a temporary job that they can't fill. So until the larger issue is resolved by the courts of what the meaning of the 14th Amendment is, and that who is a citizen, that's something that they kind of have to live with. I said, but if you reduce the term to 3 years, it'll become that'll be less of an issue.
Okay, let's take 3 or 4 more questions, and then we're going to call on Kevin. Who was next here?
Ladies first.
Let's go with Norma.
I want to know what the wage differential is. You talk about bringing them in because they're lower cost. How much less per hour do they make?
Okay, that's the first I'll tell you is that what the potential is. Okay, and if you claim you can claim the 17th percentile, or even worse. Well, I should step back for a second. When the employer makes a prevailing wage claim, they do it on something called a labor condition application. They submit this to the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor is required to approve this within 14 days as long as the form is filled out correctly. So the employer can claim anything as the prevailing wage and get it approved. That's the part where there's no real check. And the Department of Labor, in their own system, provides a prevailing wage that's at the 17th percentile, which in most areas of the country, in tech fields, it's about $20,000 a year. In this area of the country, it's most fields, the differential is about $20,000, and for tech fields, it's about $40,000. So that's the potential. In theory, employers may be paying more. When I looked at the actual wages they claimed they were doing on the LCAs in 2005, the differential was about, very conservatively, the differential was about $14,000 a year for tech workers. Okay? That's very conservative. Even that, because when I was reporting the figures, I was giving every benefit of the doubt to H-1B and knocking figures down. So it's somewhere probably between, for a tech worker, between $14,000, $15,000, up to $43,000 a year. Now the reason I have to give you that ambiguity is there's been no data reporting. Okay, we don't really know, and the reason why there's been no data reporting is because DH has wanted us to have willful ignorance on this, because we could easily tell and know what the wage differential is. One of the things the Trump administration is doing, I probably should have mentioned this question before, is they're trying to collect the data and make it available so that we will know for sure what the numbers are. And I can be pretty sure they aren't going to be very good. And that's why they've been kept secret for so long. The problem is they make public these labor condition applications. The problem with this data is that there's a single labor condition application can apply to multiple workers. Okay, so an employer can say this labor condition applies to 500 workers, but we don't know how many workers it actually applied to. And a single worker can have multiple labor condition applications. So
They can average it all together and come up with something.
well, that's what I did with my $14,000 figure. But what I had to do to get that is that there were certain large users of H-1B visas, for example, that were paying very low wages that would say I put 1,000 workers on this labor condition application, and I'd have to discard their data. Okay, so I'd have to say that this, and I was doing that a lot, and so that was dropping the wage differential down. So I'm saying that I'm cheating here on the numbers, but I was cheating here in favor of H-1B. So I was dropping the wage differential downwards.
Okay, Peter.
Are there any restrictions on extended family members coming in on H-1Bs?
Only you can only bring your immediate dependents on an H-1B visa. Yeah.
That excludes grandparents?
That's who's grandparents. Once you get the green card, then you can, once you become a citizen, then in the process you can go, and then it's when you can start bringing extended family in.
Great.
Okay, thank you, John. It's not a reflection on what we think about the individual people on immigration, because I think everyone's God's children, right? We hear that a lot from the other side, and so many of us believe that same thing. But one thing I know, and it's sort of a soft subsidy of the H-1B situation, maybe a small subset, is that the immediate family children of H-1B workers in Washington State do benefit from in-state tuition for college. So it's a small thing, but it needs to be recognized within the larger picture of just what is the subsidy of the foreign worker coming in, displacing a local worker. But my question is, what would you recommend to a candidate as your number one prescription on what to do? Get rid of the H-1B program completely. I'm not saying that would be easy, but get rid of it completely, because you've explained to us how it really doesn't mean anything, because administratively they've eviscerated the definitions. Or should we lobby for a reduction down to 30, the 3 years, or the 30,000, or a lesser number? So just to make it easy on a candidate, because it's so hard, it's such a complex issue, but what would you recommend as the most effective way just to reduce those numbers, or to handle this?
The first thing I would say, the whole H-1B program needs to be scrapped and rewritten. Okay? It's not salvageable as is. Okay. To illustrate the problem here, I told you about the H1 and H2 visas. Okay? In the United States Code, when you get the little book of all this of the laws enacted by Congress as codified, the H1 and H2 visas together were about a third of a column of text. Okay? The H1B program spans 30 pages. Okay? There's absolutely nothing in those 30 pages that's anything but mischief. You could rewrite the H1B program in a page or two. Probably could do it in the two-column format. You could probably rewrite it more effectively in one page. Because what they do, you got to keep in mind, H-1B is the best legislation money can buy. That's just, okay. It's unbelievable. I told you about the provision where the Department of Labor has to approve all labor condition applications in 14 days. So that's entirely a rubber stamp process that has no effect. The Department of Labor enforces the system, and you can say the Department of Labor has authority to enforce these provisions, one sentence. Instead, H-1B goes on for pages, on and on, saying when and when not the Department of Labor can enforce provisions. Okay? So it explicitly cannot go back and review these labor condition applications.
So within that one page, though, what is critical of the rewrite? If you even think we should rewrite it, you really think we should
I've rewritten it myself. Well, one of the problems is, and one of the issues is that the lobbyists now have been getting immigration provisions put into treaties. And so under the gas treaty, we are required to provide 65,000 visas for 3 years, okay? However, we are allowed to require that the employer find an American first, okay, which we do under the gas treaty, which we do not do. Okay, so this is one of the subversive things, with the globalist system. Under the NAFTA treaty, we have the TN visa, which is another H-1B lookalike that's mandated externally to us. We have visas for Australia. We have visas for Chile and Singapore. We've got to be able to put a stop to the putting immigration provisions in trade deals.
Okay, a couple more questions. Lori and then John, and then we're going to go to Kevin.
A couple of quick questions. So what is the process for employers proving that they've exhausted all of the possible American applications?
For an H-1B visa?
Yeah.
They don't have to do anything.
Oh, I thought you said it was under the trade.
We're allowed to impose that restriction, but we don't do it.
So we don't do it. So
We don't do it.
There's nothing.
The closest thing there is that certain employers, for certain workers, have to certify that they recruited U.S. workers in good faith, which they do by checking a box on that labor condition form, which is submitted to the Department of Labor, who has to approve it no matter what they put on there.
Okay, I get it. So the second question is, you mentioned a season for lottery applications. What is that season?
Okay, that is in the 1st of May, the 1st of April. The Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security has a lottery to pick them. So they start taking the visa application, the visa petitions 6 months before the visas start, which is the fiscal year on October 1st. So the visa petitions start on April 1st, which is kind of puzzling because the labor condition application that they have to do first at the Department of Labor is only valid for 6 years. So it's absolutely impossible for someone to submit an H-1B visa petition on that. But that's ignored anyway, so no, I mean...
I just have a suggestion.
Yeah.
If you want to use this term for spouses that replace spouses of H-1B visa workers who replace other American workers, gold chain immigration.
John.
Hi, John. In your original example of being replaced by H-1 visas, within 2 years, it appeared that the quality of the work was so poor that they had to bring back the American workers. So hence, I would think that that would nullify whatever they saved in the finance alone.
Oh, many times over, yes.
So then, have they resolved that problem? Are they sending us higher caliber of a student?
No.
Do we have students here that are higher of a caliber that is high enough?
Yeah.
But also with the work ethic.
Yeah, the problem we have is decision to go to foreign labor is made by accountants. Right? One of the things you find in the software field, and I was discussing with this our host earlier, is there's a huge variation in productivity among individual programmers. Okay, you see me, like it's probably the occupation with the greatest differential in productivity that exists on the planet. Where the programmers can do as much. You can find programmers who can do as much as 20 times more than the average person can do. Okay, but the industry does not recognize those programmers. I mean, they don't. A person who does 20 times more than the average doesn't get paid 20 times more, and the average accountant isn't going to know the difference. So the person who's making the decision, at Disney or these companies, someone sitting high on top, and they are looking at it by a per body per hour, per dollars per hour basis. Okay, they're not looking at it. And looking around, I've never seen a company actually end up saving any money doing this. But the problem, one of the problems is we have consulting firms, big consulting like McKinsey, that have whole practices devoted to outsourcing. We have places like the Duke School of Management that run seminars on how to outsource. So that's what they're selling to people. And knowing outsourcing is a requirement for any top CIO job now. There's no money to be made on books on why you shouldn't outsource, or seminars on keep doing what you're doing, don't outsource. Okay? So there's a conflict in information. It's a fad, and fads are big in the computer industry. Why we use certain programming languages in the computer industry. We don't use them because they do the job better. They use a programming language like C or C++ because they're the latest fad, not because they do a better job. It's a very fad-driven industry.
Okay, the time is 7:55. I think what we're going to do now is give John a break. I'm going to give a brief introduction for Kevin Lynn, who's going to talk to us around, 10 minutes or so?
10 minutes.
Approximately. From a little different point of view. He is the Executive Director of Progressive's for immigration reform. Let me say that again, Progressives for Immigration Reform. You didn't know such a group existed. So let me give you his short bio, which I find quite fascinating. Kevin is a longtime student of history and world affairs. If you ask where he stands politically, his response is he considers himself a lapsed Republican, an unrepentant Perotist, Ross Perot, a failed Green, a frustrated Democrat, and a very busy independent. He's an astute observer of the hijinks being played out on both sides of the political aisle, and with numerous NGO and activist groups across the country. He attended Kemper Military College. He was commissioned in the United States Army, where he worked as an infantry and counterintelligence officer before leaving the service with the rank of captain. He worked for the accounting firm of Ernst & Young and several other regional firms in the area of state and local taxation. In 2014, Kevin, along with Steve Lamb, founded the blog, the Center for Progressive Urban Politics, and he is currently the executive director, as I said, of Progressives for Immigration Reform. Kevin, welcome to Seattle.
Isn't John Miano amazing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh. I mean, the wealth of information that comes from him, it's always such a pleasure and an impossible act to follow. But again, Paul, thank you for having me here tonight for this fireside chat with such a wonderful audience. Great questions. Again, I'm Kevin Lynn, Executive Director of Progressives for Immigration Reform. And maybe before I jump into what we are, there was a question asked earlier. How many immigrants are in the United States? Roughly 43 million, representing about 3.3% of the US population. It's the highest level since the huge waves of migration at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, before we began to actually restrict immigration in 1924.
43 million is over 10% of our 330 million population.
Right, I said 13.3%.
Oh, I'm sorry, I heard you say
yes, 13.3%, okay. Yes. So, and that's why, that's probably the underlying reason that Progressives for Immigration Reform came about. We're an 11-year-old organization. I was one of the founding board members. We were founded with a Democratic governor from a Western state, folks who were looking at population stabilization, a professor emeritus of Cornell who was who taught labor economics, and a fellow who was head of the, at one point, and ran the Black Caucus Foundation in Washington, D.C. And our purpose was to look at the unintended consequences of immigration, both legal and illegal, and to have that conversation with the Democratic Party and my brothers and sisters that are left of center on the political divide. And the purpose for that is, when you look at where we really focus in two major areas. One of them is environmental. If you believe that in Anthropocene climate change, or that climate change is human activity somehow contributes to that, you have to ask yourself, what sense does it make to bring a large population of people where, let's say, for instance, there's a low carbon footprint per capita, to a country where the carbon footprint per capita is very high? For instance, here in the United States, the average carbon footprint is about 20 metric tons per year. A country like Mexico, it's about 3.4 metric tons per year. The United Kingdom is roughly 9.8. Russia is 11 metric tons, so that kind of gives you a relative idea of where we stand. The other area, which is the area that John Miano has focused so much attention on, is labor and the impact of unbridled immigration on our labor force, and how that could impact them either positively or negatively. And to look at that, you have to ask yourself, is labor immune from the laws of supply and demand? And if you believe that it's not, you have to kind of ask yourself, why does bringing so much labor into the US, how can that possibly help any one of the productive class here in America? Initially, when we started, we focused on low wage, because that's where we saw our most vulnerable people being impacted. We recently did an interesting incognito interview with a building inspector in Los Angeles who was reporting on the number of illegal immigrants working on construction sites. And we talked a lot about how in the 1980s, if you were a contractor, you were working construction, those were good middle class, upper middle class jobs. And now jobs that were paying in nominal terms $25, $30 an hour, they're now paying $10, $12 an hour for. And when you look at the cost of living in a place like Los Angeles, you know you're not getting by. You're no longer in the middle class if you have a job in construction. Now, in the area of H-1B visas, we started to get involved in this about a year ago. We built probably the first comprehensive database on LCA data. John had just mentioned that. That's the labor conditional application. And that's what an employer fills out when they want to have an H-1B worker fill a position. And so with our database, you can literally look into your zip code and find out how many applications were applied for, or your congressional district, or your city. And that's something we really want to get out to citizens that are interested in this, because you can go to your congressman and say, wait a minute, I have a kid about to graduate college, and this is what he's going to be competing with. I sat with in California, in Los Angeles County, a trustee of a community college, and he was telling me how community college the focus of many community colleges has shifted recently to where, when I was going to college, the idea was that you go to community college and go on for a 4-year degree. And however, today they really want to make it more skills-based. They want to partner with companies in their area and make sure that in 2 years someone has the skills to go out and earn a good living. That's threatened. And when I was having this lunch, I pulled out my laptop and I looked at the number of H-1B visas for his city, but more importantly, the number of H-1B visas that were skill levels 1 and 2. Because understand, 26% of the positions that they're looking to fill with H-1B visa workers, 26% require only an associate's degree. These are not high-skilled employees coming in. This isn't finding the next Einstein. What this is, these workers are quite ordinary, but they compete directly with our college graduates now who are looking to get in the workplace. So it's certainly a hindrance. Now, as I mentioned, we created that database a year ago. We weren't getting a lot of attention for it, and certainly it's a topic we really wanted to drive attention with and have that conversation with my progressive brothers and sisters with. So a month ago, we did a saturation campaign on the Bay Area rapid transit system. And essentially, we put posters for 2 weeks up in 200 trains and saturated the Civic Center and 19th Street stations with advertising. You couldn't walk into one of those stations and not see an ad. And what the ad said was, U.S. tech workers, your companies think that you are expensive, undeserving, and expendable. Congress, fix the H-1B visa program, seek to hire U.S. workers first. Well, you can almost imagine it was like sticking your hand in a hornet's nest. Yeah. One reporter said it was akin to rubbing steel wool on an open wound. And of course, when the initial commentary, I think it was the BuzzFeed reporter was probably the first one to get a hold of me Friday morning, because we had posted the ads on a Thursday evening. And even after telling her that I am the son of an immigrant, I'm closer to the immigrant experience than many people in the country. And when my mother came to this country in 1952, we'd let out only 178,000 green cards. Last year, we let out somewhere around 1.2 million. So just in legal alone, it was also very regulated. Between that period of 1924 and, as John had mentioned, 1965, it was very regulated. My mother had to appear before an immigration officer at least once, sometimes twice a year. And they wanted to know what she was doing, was she earning a wage, she wasn't dependent on anyone. And it was a good time for immigrants. My mother would talk about how after she was working, doing accounting at a hat shop, and how every month after she would find more money in her paycheck. And when she asked them, they said, well, you know, we don't have to check your numbers, you're doing great. And so it was a good time for immigrants. It was a good time for native-born Americans because we'd built the middle class. You look at the landscape today, everyone I speak to, my peers who are in their 50s, everyone is insecure. They're insecure about their job. They're insecure about their retirement prospects. And it is so closely linked to our labor markets. So that is the reason we exist. And as I'd mentioned, we've taken a focus on the H-1B because we started thinking this was a lower skilled worker problem. But no, it runs the gambit. And what we're seeing now is that you can invest a lot of money getting your degree, getting those skills, looking to get experience, and you may not even make it onto the labor market. Only a tad over 20% of college students that get degrees in STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, mathematics, are working in their fields. Granted, some are going off to matriculate into a master's program or PhD, but the vast majority are not finding employment in these in-demand skills. Moreover, and I know John will probably speak to this in much greater detail than I can, you look at the statistics from the Bureau of Labor, you look at what the Bureau of Labor and Statistics is putting out, and STEM wages are essentially flat. And you have to ask yourself, step back. If these jobs are in such great demand, why aren't wages rising congruently with that demand? And what's going on, as John had talked about, a great example is Disney, Northeast Utilities. They laid off 220 tech workers in one fell swoop. I interviewed a fellow by the name of Craig D'Angelo. He's actually now running for Congress in Hartford, that congressional district, to bring attention to this issue. But in one fell swoop, they laid these people off. That is not, that's displacement is what it is, and that's the purpose. John had mentioned Disney. The woman who built the back end of our SQL database, Dina Moore, was one of those people fired at Disney. Dina Moore is someone who knows SQL, SQL like the back of her hand. She has 12 Microsoft certificates or certifications, and she is a constant learner and a pleasure to work with, someone who always undersells, over-delivers, and she, along with all of her colleagues, were laid off. So that's the conversation we really want to have with the left. Because I think, at the end of the day, we all want to feel good. We want to believe that, we are somehow making the world a better place, not just for ourselves, but for our communities, our state, our country. And so it's very easy to say, well, let's bring someone in, let's give them a shot at all this. But sometimes you do have to look at it and say, wait a minute, who benefits? Obviously the immigrant is benefiting. Obviously the company that employs them and gets to pay them less, give them few, if no benefits, is making out. But who isn't? It's the worker. And when we started, we were looking at our most vulnerable. I lived in Los Angeles for 20 years. I moved about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now. And I lived next to Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, right on Los Angeles Street. And I would trip over homeless. And, we actually had a nice détente going. We all knew each other. But today, when I went back about 6 months ago, I will tell you, Skid Row is probably twice as big as it was. And not only that area known as Skid Row, but go through LA County, under every highway underpass, there is an encampment of homeless, because our most vulnerable have now not just been ratcheted out of the job market, they have been ratcheted out of their apartments, their homes. A good friend of mine, he and his wife are desperate. I see their emails at least once a week, where there is a woman who had a job in a call center. They outsourced that job, and now her and her child are living in their car. So this is the reality of what's going on. There's I guess the ideal is that, we're opening up the doors, creating all this opportunity, and all we're doing is hurting our most vulnerable. And not even our most vulnerable now. It's everyone up. It's really the productive class, that middling class that this country relies on for a tax base to build and those taxes to build our infrastructure and create an overall improvement in our way of life year over year. So I'll end it there. I'm sorry if I went over.
Let's see if there's a couple of questions, then we're going to move on back to John.
Yes.
Okay, Lori?
Sorry.
So very rarely do we hear about the environmental impact of immigration, illegal or legal. I remember when I was in elementary school in Oklahoma, my elementary school teachers from 4th grade through 6th grade talked incessantly about population explosion, the J curve, the whole thing, and scared us. I mean, it's imprinted in my brain. And then suddenly everyone quit talking about that. I remember that even in the 70s, the Sierra Club was talking about the impact of immigration. And then suddenly now they're all pro-open borders. My question to you is twofold. What was that pivotal moment? And how do we talk to liberals about this?
Yes.
Successfully.
There was a pivotal moment, and I'll talk about that. And you're right, 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, think about it. The first Lost in Space, remember the old Lost in Space, not the one that's out right now, and even the one that's out right now is interesting too, in this respect. But the first one, they're getting ready to launch, the television screen comes on, it's the President of the United States, and the reason they're going to Alpha Centauri is because we've overpopulated the Earth and the pollution and all the externalities. We have to get off this planet. And it was, think of Soylent Green, for instance. There's that scene with Charlton Heston and, I can't think of the older actor's name, but he's talking to him about, how we had real butter at one point. There was real meat. We weren't, it was really ingrained in us. And that movie started off talking about the population of New York City at that time, So, and there was a pivotal moment. That came in the early 90s. It was revealed what happened. There was a fellow named Galbaum, if I pronounced the name correctly.
I was wondering if that was true. I always heard that. And I
it is true, because he admitted it to a reporter in the LA Times in 1993. Wow. He donated $100 million to the Sierra Club. And the string attached was, you can no longer talk about immigration. And there was a rebellion. People like Captain Watson of Sea Shepherd. He was one of the critical voices. On our board is Dr. Ben Zuckerman, Professor Emeritus, UCLA in astrophysics. He was another rebel. Frank Morris. There are a number of people that were trying to get on the slate, to get on the board of the Sierra Club to change us. They were defeated. But that's what happened. It's always the money. And they followed the money, and even today they will not talk about population, which to me is frightening. And on that theme, we did a blog. I and a young attorney at Early, the Immigration Reform Law Institute, worked on a piece called NEPA in the Age of Trump. And NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. And what we posited was, instead of gutting NEPA, let's use it. Let's study immigration, do a 5-year hiatus, while we look at the impact of immigration is having on environment, because we know it is. It's like anything else. It's supply and demand. If there are more people, there's going to be more demand for housing, which means more urban sprawl, which means less habitat and ecosystems that we're reliant on. So.
Okay, one more question, we're going to go back to John. Deal?
Do you believe that Americans have become, shall we say, too compassionate about immigration? Because you talked about how the mother and her son in Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, correct.
Los Angeles, yes.
In the county.
Yes, how she was, now she's homeless because of the program. She was replaced by someone in that program. So again, my question is, would you say that Americans have become too compassionate when it comes towards immigration, that we're not caring for, the American worker themselves as much anymore, that we're more concerned with being, there's a certain phrase called virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Would you say that Americans have become, again, too compassionate when it comes towards immigration?
I'll answer that in 2 steps. I'll talk about, second question I'll answer is virtue signaling. In the first, are we too compassionate? I would offer we're not. I mean, we're perfectly happy killing brown people all over the world, people strange to us. We like to watch it on the news. We think this is great. Now, it all kind of feeds into what I was saying. Why are we in the Mideast? We are in it for the oil, no other reason. Why are we in Afghanistan? Well, they have rare earth metals that we're going to need for our iPhones and other things that drive the technology that have given us this modern way of life. But what I will say is people want to feel good. They want to feel that they've done something. There is that wonderful movie with Michael Caine, and it's called Secondhand Lions. Yeah. What's the other actor? It's Michael Caine and Robert Duvall. And there's a scene in there where, he stops these young little ruffians from, trying to take his food, and he says, hey, this is the problem. No one's ever taught this young man how to behave in public, things like that. And so now they think they can do whatever they want. And he used the term people are just too good-natured to stop them. And I think that's what it is. People are we're good-natured. I mean, I wouldn't want to deprive someone of that opportunity. Oh my God, look at where they're living in Mexico City, for instance. If you're living in one of the inner rings, or outer rings rather, it's different in Mexico. It's a squalid existence. But the reality is this. I believe in borders, and I believe that we should be nationalistic in that we seek to protect the interests of our citizens first, then all others. And we'd learned that. Before 1924, restricting immigration was a populist plank. It was because they understood what was going on. The chambers of commerce, the companies were literally paying the steerage to bring people over here and take jobs and keep them from organizing by creating this huge supply of labor. So and virtue signaling. Yes, it's a real issue, but it's not just, because that could be overcome. That could be overcome with reason. I would say that there are some very bad actors that play to the left of, the same way the right has bad actors that play to people of the right of center perspective. The left of center, you have folks like George Soros, who not too long ago, through one of his emails were hacked for the Open Society Foundation, put $118 million just into the United States for programs. And they really are very effective in shutting down the discussion and creating organizations that put the rights of immigrants before the rights of citizens. And that's an issue to me.
And they get people elected.
And they do get people. They're very effective at organizing, particularly at the grassroots level.
Let's give Kevin a hand. Okay, while John is coming back up, this is kind of a long session, a couple hours. Let's have everybody stand up for 60, 90 seconds. Stretch your legs for a minute while John's coming back up here. Just gonna take a short little break here.
Each one of these love child, Beltway crap, crony captains.
That's right. I can't remember what his. Who can get a worker that they pay less money to, and it's a subsidy. And you know who likes it?
He thinks.
And Microsoft. Sure, all the big companies. But it has an effect on American workers.
I'm astounded to hear Connors say, especially,
Yeah,
hear the president say that.
he doesn't like songs. He's just undermining it.
Oh, absolutely.
He was the one who last night said there's 4 parties. There are the populist Democrats, which would be Bernie Sanders. There's the corporate Democrats, which would be Hillary. There's the populist Republicans, which is Trump. And then there's the Chamber of Commerce corporate Republicans, which are like Mitch McConnell and those. And there's this tension in those parties.
That's an interesting balance. That makes sense.
And you know how much trouble Trump caused? Yes. People just got tired of it.
You did. You go. Right. No, and that explains some divisions within the party.
That's right.
That's like that.
That's a long time. Well,
No, it's up to 6 years. It's a minimum of 3 and up to 6, and administratively they can.
no idea.
It's somewhere in the middle. There's 6 years right now, and then they can go to a green card. So they have that worker, let's say for $20,000-$30,000 less, and then they have a 6-year program, and then they apply for a green card, and that process takes a while. So they have a captive worker for maybe 10 years who can't jump companies. This is a University of Washington graduate, they can leave in 2 years and go someplace else. So they like it with the lower salaries and wages, and they like it.
We can't prove conspiracy. We can't prove it, so we can't say it, but it does say it, the brief does say, in the end, we should allow, this should,
It's modern day
we should allow initiatives by.
Let's take our seats and restart here.
Emphasize, and I hope Dick can put in even more, is the idea that the city council reserves the express the voice of the voter. The very same human being.
Let's take our seats and get started with round 2.
Those reserve sections don't hold the deal. That subverted their own.
Everything else doesn't matter because the only thing that matters is getting
I think that should be pointed out. They should not allow that to happen. It's not a matter of against. So anyway, I just have fairness here.
Okay, we're going to have session 2 with John Miano. He's going to change gears here a little bit. So John, you just take it away. Let's have everybody seated. Okay, Doug, you're all set?
You need to move over. Yeah, I think I was about to say, maybe you're too close there.
Okay, John, go ahead. Round 2.
Well, I was told to speak on another area here, something called optional practical training. Unfortunately, I need to give a lot of background here, a lot of dealing with legal issues. One thing is, how many lawyers do we have here? Okay. Not well. Aren't you a lawyer?
I am not.
You're not. Okay. Just okay. Yeah. So, yeah, we have to. And let me say, how many of you have favorable impression of lawyers?
favorable?
Favorable impression of lawyers.
Just lawyers.
Okay. So it's not a very good. And and that's a big problem. And because I went to law school very late in life, I've lived lived outside of lawyers and know how lawyers and the courts are perceived by the general public. So while I was preparing for this, I had the TV set on. I don't know. I think the cat might even turn the TV set on because I wasn't really watching. But they did a promo for Hill Street Blues reruns. I know that, the little kitty cat. She knows where to come. You want to come up here? You want to come up here while this? We did a promo for Hill Street Blues, and they had Frank Ferrillo testifying before committee, and he said, "Corruption flourishes where an atmosphere for tolerance prevails," which kind of fits what we're having here. To begin, let me start with something which is called the Administrative Procedure Act. We're going to always feel like being in law school here. Congress, under the Constitution, Congress has most of the power. Right? But what Congress does is it delegates power to the executive, the president, and the agencies to administer certain things. Okay? And this is done under the Administrative Procedure Act. And that authorizes the agencies, once they've been delegated power, to promulgate regulations to implement that power. And there are procedures for doing that. In general, a regulation, they have to put it for public notice and comment. Then the public, they give public notice, and then the public can comment on the regulations. And then the agency is supposed to go and look at the comments and then put them, and then incorporate them into the regulations or reject them and give some reason why. In certain cases, they can do emergency regulations, like you might have recently heard about a helicopter crash in the Hudson where the people couldn't get out. Where life and death situations are, the agencies could do regulations without notice and comment. Say, you can't do we can't have helicopter flights now with the doors open and that people are fastened in so they can't get out. There have been emergency regulations in the FAA where they didn't have. Where the slot system at Washington National Airport expired, and they just did emergency regulations to keep the airport from being completely shut down. So they have can get around that. The other important aspect of the Administrative Procedure Act is that the courts are the arbiters of the scope of the agency's power. So Congress has said Congress delegates power to the agency, but also delegates to the courts the responsibility to ensure that the agencies operate within the limits of that power. And under the Administrative Procedure Act, APA, you can sue the agency for being arbitrary and capricious, for acting in excess of its authority, or not following the procedures, like giving notice and comment. Okay? As we can go through, that system is completely broken down. And start with two of the reasons why it's broken down. The first is there's a doctrine in the courts called standing. Okay? That you have to have standing to bring a lawsuit in the federal courts. And standing is one of those mystery things that we don't really know what the rules are. The rules change all the time. Justice Scalia, in 1970, the Supreme Court declared that standing was a constitutional requirement. It's never been, it's not mentioned in the Constitution, and before 1970, it had not been a constitutional requirement. Justice Scalia was the person who formulated the current main standing rules, which are that you have to have an injury, in fact, as it's called, traceable to the action you're challenging, and it has to be redressable. And then there's a second test, which they call the zone of interest test, that you have to be within the zone of interest of the regulations you're challenging. Okay, so it's basically the two halves. I've greatly simplified this. And so what I always tell my liberal friends, when you hear claims that Scalia was a originalist, just say the word standing. You can disprove that. Scalia was a conservative, not a religious. The problem, these rules are highly malleable, and the courts tend to treat them very politically. When we bring these cases, we spend more time on standing than we actually do on the case itself, the merits of the case. We spend more research, more briefing time, because every time you bring a case, it's like the standing rules are brand new. That some things that you thought had been decided decades ago have to be re-argued every single time you bring a case. And things can be very malleable. At one end, we may have heard the Washington State versus Trump case over the so-called Muslim ban. Okay, standing becomes an issue, and that Judge Robarts, who's on video, he says that the law of standing. He says I think everyone here can agree the law of standing is murky, and I'm finding standing. Okay, now so on one end, the courts can just say it's murky, and you're in. I'll say that's never happened to me. On the other hand, the courts literally, in many cases, just make up new standing rules at the drop of a hat to keep plaintiffs out of the courts. Okay? The other big issue with the regulations is something called Chevron Deference. This actually came before Scalia, but Scalia was a big proponent of this. And that is that the courts don't second guess the agency. Under Chevron, there's in theory a two-part test that the court asks whether the rule is within the agency's authority, and then if it isn't, then if it's not within authority, then you can challenge it. If it is, then the courts ask whether it's arbitrary and capricious. In reality, if you get to the point where you're asking whether it's arbitrary and capricious, you've lost already. Because the courts give great, the deference to the agencies is so great. So what I want to do now is just, again, some observations on the courts, because we'll get back to the administrative law, for someone who's been an outsider. And one of the things, first I'll raise to you, is that there's a great disconnect between how the courts perceive themselves and how the public perceives them. I think the Chief Justice will say we have the greatest legal system in the world. Everything is hunky dory. Well, I think most of the public will say I think we have some serious problems, and I can see people here who I know who are acknowledging that that's the fact, that's the case. One of the issues also to find is that justice is or should be defined by who gets prosecuted. And I point this out in the special counsel, think about that in the back of your mind. But what came to my mind on this is, you might have remembered during the presidential campaign, Corey Lewandowski was in legal trouble because he grabbed the arm of a reporter. Okay. Now, under Florida law, if you go up to someone and you're on a bus and you tap them on the shoulder and say, "Excuse me, I need to get by to get off," you've committed the crime of battery. And can go to jail for it. Okay, so crime of battery. You've committed the crime of battery if you tap someone on the shoulder. And technically, Corey Lewandowski, by grabbing the woman, has committed the crime of battery. Okay. It's up to the prosecutor to show some common sense in here, in which cases get brought. Okay, is there some real offense? Because once you bring the case, the person who the case is brought is screwed. Even if they successfully defend the case, they have their reputation spared. They're going to bankrupt themselves defending themselves. Okay, and the courts are highly political, particularly in these regulation areas. And it's just not me, but whenever you see a story about a court decision, you always will see. The Republicans voted this way, and the Democrat judges voted this way. So, actually, even if it's not me saying the court's political, people believe the courts are political. The press believes it. Okay, that's something to look at. And they instinctively protect the government. The courts instinctively protect the government. There's a twofold problem there. One, many of the judges are U.S. attorneys and have worked up the ranks, and then they follow the path, U.S. attorney, magistrate, judge, and they're very deferential to the U.S. attorney's offices. And even if they haven't, after they're getting their paycheck from the government, and you're there a long enough time, you become part of the government.
Does that include Schneiderman? That's the state attorney, I guess.
Yeah, he's the state attorney as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will illustrate this last, protecting the government. I'm from New Jersey. I don't know if you helped there. We're the state of honest government. And one of the problems in the city of Newark, the mayor serially go to jail. And I was at an Italian dinner, but people I didn't know. There was a group of Italians, and one of them was a builder, and he was talking about how they do business in Newark. And he said that if you want to do something in Newark, you go to the city hall, you have a meeting with the mayor's aide, and you describe what you want to do. The aide writes a number on a slip of paper, and then arranges a meeting with the mayor. You take that, use the number as the amount of cash you put into a briefcase, and you have your meeting with the mayor, and you forget to take your briefcase home. Okay. He was describing that thing, and you might know of our mayor, former governor Chris Christie. He was the one who got convicted the mayor in question, Sharp James. Okay? Sharp James, for his corruption, was sentenced to 27 months in prison. Okay? We'll talk about prison. The judge said of this person, I'm quoting from an article from the New York Star-Ledger, in justifying this low sentence, I have a track record here of a man who is 72 years old and who has accomplished a lot in life. Okay? You talk about deference to a crook, but it's to the government. The article also notes that this mayor, who had never had a private job in his life, had amassed a yacht, a Rolls Royce, 8 properties, and millions in the bank. Okay, so this is a person who's only lived off a public job. Now, in contrast, do you remember Scooter Libby? He was convicted of something we don't really know. He got 2.5 years, bigger sentence than for corruption. So I'll just give it. And the Libby thing also, I think, illustrates problem. The same one of the tapping on the shoulder issue that I got. You imagine if we said a prosecutor went out onto the New York subways and went out with police to arrest everyone who tapped someone on the shoulder to get off the subway. Okay, so we have basically equivalent with this special prosecutor system where we turn someone loose to convict people of something. Let's find something to convict, not in the normal process of how justice would go. And also, I think it's we know in the Liberal case that the special prosecutor was convened during the Bush administration when Bob Novak had written an article reporting that Valerie Plame was a CIA agent. So we had a special counsel because it was believed that the Bush administration was leaking this to undermine Flame because she was a critic of the Iraq stuff. And we learned that the person who did it was Richard Armitage, who was not even charged here. And the only person convicted was not even connected with this disclosure. But we find something that he did in the process and we convict him. So, 3 more observations. One, the legal system generates work for itself. You would not. You see this when Congress passes laws, complicated ambiguous laws, create jobs for lawyers. When I tell you the story that's going to follow, there's a story that's going to follow this build up here. But when I tell this story, it's the same thing. I testified before Congress on the story that I'm going to tell you. And one of the Senate staffers told me that every year the Chief Justice sends us a report saying we need more judges because the courts are overworked. But we see cases like yours and realize that if we doubled the number of judges, the amount of legal work would double as well, and they'd still be busy. Okay? A big problem, which I'll tell you, in the U.S., is that of precedent. Precedent only gets lip service in America. In theory, we have a common law system where the lower courts decide issues. The appeals courts then rationalize it and unify the issues by eliminating the conflicts at each level so that we have a uniform legal system. In reality, we appoint judges for the purpose of reaching particular legal outcomes in specific cases. You know, you'll hear things like, we want judges who will look out for the rights of women and minorities. You know, in other words, we'll give if a woman comes into this case, we'll give it one outcome. If it's a corporation with similar facts, we'll give it a different outcome. And the result is, when you study the law, American law, it's quite chaos. One of the projects I did for a former employer for legal research system, I was looking at case law in other common law countries, Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And the thing that was immediately striking was how in those other countries the judges worked so much harder to conform to precedent and to have a uniform law. Okay, in the United States, if the precedent fits with the outcome they get, it works. If not, we just ignore it. And so in many areas of law, we just have parallel precedent, so it becomes an a la carte menu. And this unpredictability benefits lawyers, because if you come to a lawyer with a case and the law is clear, the lawyer can say, yes, you have a case, no, you don't have a case. But with this parallel law, you have a case in almost every situation. So it's great for lawyers. And the last point I'll give before jumping into the final thing is the legal system seems to strive for inefficiency. Similar thing, not done. So the main focus of this topic is something called the Optional Practical Training Program. I mentioned before, that the executive branch is claiming the ability to allow aliens to work in addition to Congress. So under Obama, the USCIS was saying that foreign labor may be authorized in the United States either by regulation or by Congress. So they had equal authority to Congress. But what the Optional Practical Training Program was created in 1952, and what it did was allowed any alien on a student visa to remain in the United States for a year after graduation and work. Okay? And this particular regulation was promulgated without notice and comment, just shoved out there. And you have a couple problems here. First, the procedure wasn't followed. It was done without notice and comment. And the second is a student visa, as Congress has defined it, is for a bona fide student solely pursuing a course of study at an approved academic institution that will report termination of attendance. That clearly does not encompass a person who has graduated and is working out in the industry for a year. But it kind of was under the radar here. No one sued over this, and you're going to see why no one sued over this at this stage. So now we come up to 2007. Okay. Think about what I've told you about the story of the H-1B program. Congress expanded the H-1B program as told in 1998. They expanded again in 2000. They lowered the prevailing wage requirements in 2004. But by 2007, the Congress was getting tired of the tech industry asking for more, and there was no H-1B increase in sight. So the tech industry came up with a solution, specifically Microsoft. They went to this optional practical training program that was allowing aliens to work for a year and said, and came up with a scam, why don't we let them work for 3 years, which is the same length as an H-1B visa, on a student visa, and so then we can use H-1B visas, we can use student visas as a substitute for H-1B visas. And then Microsoft and several other tech companies threw the DHS secretary a dinner party at the home of the billionaire owner of the Washington Nationals, where they pitched this idea. And then from there, DHS worked in absolute secrecy with industry lobbyists to craft regulations. And in 2008, threw the regulations out the door without notice and comment, without even telling anyone they were even doing these regulations. Okay? It's complete behind the scenes regulation by lobbyists happened.
During the Bush administration.
This happened at the end of the Bush administration. As you can imagine, all these people in the Bush administration are about to lose their jobs. They're going to, so they want to curry favor with the industry for their post-Bush administration lobbying assignments. Okay, so we have this. So now we've created this, entirely without notice and comment, with not even telling the public that we're doing it. They've thrown out and created a brand new guest worker program. So then, at this point, we sue. I become the attorney. And this is actually my first case in federal courts. The Programmers Guild, which I said, and a number of other tech groups banded together to challenge these new regulations for not giving notice and comment and for being unlawful. These people are not students. This was an eye-opening experience. So we go into the District Court of New Jersey and we run into standing. It had been fairly settled law that economic injury is an injury that grants standing. That if a government action increases competitors with you, you have standing to bring a lawsuit. And pretty well, until we came along, that had been pretty well settled law. But the government files their motion to dismiss, and they're arguing at length that this is not an injury. So we file our response, and we go through this whole litany of history of competitive injury being an injury that gives rise to standing. Okay. And then the government, in its reply, comes up with this argument that but it doesn't apply to labor. Applies to everyone else but labor. And we're sitting there thinking, but you cited cases where labor had standing. We cited cases where labor had standing. This can't be it. So it goes through. So then the opinion comes out, and as the government argues, competitive injury does not apply to labor. I'm like, did you check that, Judge? And the whole opinion was, as the government argues, as DHS asserts, as DHS says, and went on and on like this. Okay? And to give you I think to give you an idea of provide an example of how the courts view themselves contrary to how the public views the courts. A reporter from CNN called me up right after this opinion was released. He'd been following the case, and he calls me up, and the very first question of his house, I'm not even making this up, is, John, did you molest Judge Hochberg's daughter? Yes. That was the only thing he could come up with to explain that opinion. Okay? And all the other comments I got from reporters after that were equally bizarre. Now, in this opinion, I told you that the courts make new rules. That was one of the new rules. The court had invented that competitive injury does not apply to labor. And then another one, she also said we didn't satisfy the zone of interest test where you have to be within the statute in question. She's changed it that you have to be within the zone of interest of the regulation you challenged. Okay, which is kind of bizarre, because if you had to be in the zone of interest of the regulation you're challenging, no one could challenge the regulation because you'd always be within the zone of interest of it. So now we appeal this case, and we go to the Third Circuit, and I get to argue before the Third Circuit that a statute is not a regulation and a regulation is not a statute, while the government argues that that a regulation is a statute. I would have thought they might have conceded that, but no, we had that ridiculous argument, and we got to deal with the competitive injury. But the Third Circuit then invented a new standing rule. They invented a new standing rule to find that we did not satisfy the zone of interest test, that we were not arguably within the zone of interest of the statutes, even though the Supreme Court has repeatedly said protecting American workers is a primary purpose of the immigration statute, and we had supplied the court with legislative history showing that the agency and Congress had expressly given intent to protect American workers under the statute. But there's a solution to this problem too. So that wasn't the answer the court wanted to get. There's something called the non-precedential opinion. that the courts have, the federal courts have invented something called non-precedential opinion, in which they deal with routine cases, which they tell us is for routine cases that they deal with repeatedly over and over again, like these prisoner appeals where they don't want to do a full opinion. They just want to say, you know, this is the outcome, where there's nothing really for us to analyze here. But in this case, we had something brand new. Obviously, it does not fit it. But the opinion is completely contrary to precedent, but then they make it non-precedential so they don't follow this. So other cases have appeared since then dealing with the same issue, but this case is completely ignored in the Third Circuit. Okay, so that's round one. So now we bring this, I'm the attorney for this case again, same challenge, the same regulation again. This time in the D.C. District Court, and the plaintiff is the Washington Alliance of Technology Workers, a local union here. And so it's exactly the same as the previous case up there, and the same arguments, but this time they're standing. Exact same thing. Okay. Well, we only got through part of this problem here, and it goes through. But the judge holds that the regulations in question are lawful. That she says that in the opinion states that under the Chevron doctrine, that the definition of a student visa can be interpreted as only being an entry requirement, and then once the alien comes to the United States, DHS can let them do anything they want. Now, under that interpretation, we have no immigration system. Okay, but we'll put that one aside, and I don't even think the judge believed that analysis, but. We'll put that aside and come back to it. But then she held that the regulations were made without notice and comment unlawfully. Okay? So the law says that since the regulations are made without following the procedure required by law, they're supposed to be set aside. So district court, but the opinion says, okay, I'm going to set them aside, but I'm going to wait for 6 months to set it aside and stay it, and you can go back and do notice and comment again on the same regulation. Okay? Now. There's no value to notice and comment after the fact, because what's the agency going to do? They're going to come to a different conclusion? Mm-hmm. No, whatever. So we appeal this. We appeal this whole thing. Then 6 months later, the DHS has working on regulations. Instead of doing the old regulations and submitting again, they decided to do a new regulation, which they're going to expand the work period even longer. Take that. And they go to the district court and say, we're not going to get the regulations done. Can you extend this period of time? And so we go back to the district court. So we respond, but judge, this case is on appeal. You don't have jurisdiction over this case anymore. Here's the case law showing that you don't have jurisdiction to change the judgment while it's on appeal. They need to go to the appeals court. And here's one of your own opinions that says that. Well, so much for precedent. I don't care. We do it and it gets done anyway. Which then has terrible repercussions down. And this illustrates why this rule's in, what I'm going to tell you illustrates why this rule's in place. Because then we get to the appeals court and we argue it, and DHS now argues, well, we're putting out these new regulations going into effect in two years and in a couple of weeks, and so now this case is moot. And we go back and we say to the court, but the new regulations do the same thing as these old regulations. They just make it longer. And so the DC Circuit then says, oh, they're new regulations, it's moot, go back and start it over again. Right? So we now file the case again for the third time. Okay. And DHS, they make an obligatory, DHS makes an obligatory motion to dismiss for failure to state claim and standing. The district court says they're standing, but then the district court holds that we failed to state a claim of which relief can be granted. Okay. Case is dismissed again, even though these are exact same claims that have gone through two times previously. Scratching our head. So now we appeal this case again. Third time we go for the DC Circuit, and I got to say that the DC Circuit was not sympathetic to the case, to the argument that we had not stated a claim. I think that they said that it was the height of chutzpah to say that we had not stated a claim. The opinion has not come out yet. One concerning thing is that they did say that we're raising the standing issue again. So we're sitting there, gosh, they could they could dismiss the case on standing, and we have to do this a fourth time. And they could, and we're waiting. In theory, they could decide the case because this is a question of law. Okay? They could decide the case, or they could remand it back to the district court to go through the whole thing again. Okay? I'll point out that in 2 weeks we're hitting the 10th anniversary of this. Okay? Wow. Okay. So and our best hope is that the D.C. Circuit will decide this case and put an end to it. Okay, and one of the things I take is that things don't become precedent until an appeals court decides them. And that's why issues like this routinely will get raised to the Court of Appeals. Like when the district court says that these regulations are within DHS authority, that's not precedential until they get to the next level. But keep in mind that this is a case. This is strictly what we call a question of law in this case. Okay? There's no witnesses coming through here. There's no discovery, whatever. All you're going through is asking the court, is this action by DHS legal? And it's been through the courts 10 years. Okay? Not too many lawyers my age can say that their first case, they're still working on their first case. Okay? And so what we have here is, it illustrates that the system of judicial review is completely broken down. Congress is aware of this. They want to do something about, there have been bills to do something about the Chevron Deference. But think about it, even if the DC Circuit does the absolute best possible outcome of deciding the case, it's still taken 10 years. So that this program has been going on, well, we hope illegally for 10 years. In the meantime, this program now has been grown, that was designed to supplement the H-1B program, is now larger than the H-1B program. Okay. And I would also point out, imagine that if the courts had decided this, let's say that the courts do agree that this is illegal, it is unlawful. The DHS does not have the authority to allow people to be students for years after they graduate. If that's true, and the courts had decided that on the original case, it would have marginal impact. Now, that would mean shutting down a program that's larger than H-1B, okay, by letting it fester. We'd also talk about judicial efficiency. Remember I told the observation of the Senate staff. From just us alone, this case has gone through the courts, through appeal, 3 times already. Okay? There's no efficiency here by these dismissals for standing, dismissals for failure to state a claim. They don't bring any efficiency. All that has been done is kicking the can down the road. Making this even worse is that we have all these other cases being raised where raising this exact same issue. So it's probably being the legal effort is probably being multiplied by a factor of 10 here. Wow. Okay. So this is a giant mess. But what we're illustrating here, what I'll close here and illustrate here, is one, the agencies have run amok, that they just ignore their statutory authority. The rules of standing have created a defense for any unlawful action. Okay? The agency can do anything unlawful and then argue standing as a defense, and it will cost you $300,000 to defend, just to argue the standing portion of it. And the courts are not enforcing, not doing their part to ensure that the agencies remain within their bounds of their authority, at least within a timely fashion here. And I think I don't know if we have a disagreement that 10 years seems to be a ridiculous amount of time to take for courts to make a decision on this particular question. So I think we need to, how we would reform the courts is a tough question. I think that the Congress needs to take a look at what types of people we're appointing, judges, and I think we need more engineers and scientists who are used to dealing with efficiency on the courts to move things along, rather than to have this bureaucratic process where we let the matters run forever and ever. So I will end there and let you take questions.
It's exactly 9 o'clock. Let's take some questions. I'm going to ask the first one. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that same principle apply to DACA as to whether President can administratively do that? Isn't it the same
Yes.
questions?
That's
And what's your prediction on what will happen with DACA?
we're going to have the DACA thing. You know, here's one possibility. I'll give you one weird possibility. Let's say the court, the D.C. Circuit, where we're waiting an opinion, does make a decision on whether these OPT regulations are lawful. That issue directly affects DACA. It's in theory possible that either us or DHS could appeal to the petition to the Supreme Court to hear the case and say now it's time to consolidate all these things. My guess is that the majority of the court is not going to find that DACA is lawful, though.
So you think it's likely that Congress will do nothing but beat each other over the head with it, Democrats against Republicans? Ultimately, the Supreme Court will decide, and right now it'd be 5-4, that the president doesn't have that authority.
The president doesn't have authority, yes. I think that's what would happen.
Wow.
Well, what about the former president, though?
Yeah, he definitely doesn't have authority.
That's what we're looking under.
Yeah. Well, this is the,
So let's take some questions here.
I just would throw one point out there. I think that had this is DACA lawful? Had that been asked? Does Barack Obama have this power? Would bring a different answer than does Donald Trump have this power in the courts?
Yeah, as a political decision.
Okay, questions, Craig?
Yes, and Paul's question is apropos because I wanted to ask, and this was DC Circuit or District Court that you're in right now?
District Court and then the DC Circuit. So it's in the DC Circuit right now.
Okay, the circuit. What is your best possible, you say you want them to decide it, but what do you want them to decide? And given that best outcome, how will it affect the DACA decision?
Well, the best possible outcome, I mean, ultimately, is the DC Circuit says that the optional practical training program is unlawful. Okay, that is the best possible outcome for us. And then, if that happens, my guess is DHS would petition the Supreme Court, or I should say that they might not petition the Supreme Court, knowing that it would bring the DACA and all these other things into play as well.
Because the same circuit court would have to make the same decision on DACA then. If they just said without notice and all this thing, the OPT is illegal.
Well, see, the DACA program isn't being contested in the DC Circuit right now. It's all over, going on all over the country. And you know what happens is, because of the chaos law, remember, we've heard like the so-called Muslim ban. Well, some of the courts have said that the ban is lawful. Others have said that it's not. But because you can get these multiple outcomes, what you do is you file the case in multiple courts, and all you need is one to get the injunction ban, the outcome that you desire.
Okay, further questions, Bob?
How would you respond to those who would argue that the only reason the H-1B visa people are coming to this country is because they can earn more money here than they could in their home country? They come here, reduces the supply in their home country, increases the economic prosperity of their compatriots that they've left behind, and eventually, if we just leave it alone or even expand the program, the invisible hand of capitalism will work its magic and everything will even out.
Well, that would take probably centuries to even out. quite sure. I mean, we're talking about countries where flush toilets are a novelty. I mean, quite literally.
Yeah. You've not had that conversation with anyone?
No, don't think that.
Lori?
And pardon my naivety on this, but if it's so profitable to use this labor, why don't companies like Microsoft just up and move to Bangalore?
Then, okay, a couple of things. Well, I'll give you a couple of reasons. First of all, you have to deal with the infrastructure over there. Okay, that's the first thing.
No toilets.
You can build your own infrastructure if you're Bill Gates.
Okay. I will also. I worked for a company until a few years ago that had done the offshoring to India, and we had a senior manager go to India, and she contracted some tropical disease there and died in agony over a year. Okay?
Oh, wow.
So that means you have to go to India. Your senior managers have to live there, out there. They have lots of power failures there. Infrastructure. Plus, and quite frankly, the labor there doesn't have the qualities it does here, and in many countries.
And their legal system is clear and straightforward, unlike ours.
Yes. The term red tape was invented to describe the Indian legal system.
Art form.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, are there any further questions? Lori?
John, thank you again for all of this. It's quite informative. So just to be clear, what you're saying with this program, where a student graduates from their course of study and then they go into this optional, whatever you said,
Optional practical training.
So that literally means they just go into a job, they're a college graduate, they go straight into a job that they can hold for 3 years. And obviously are competing against people who...
And then they can apply for an H-1B visa during that 3 years. And then they can apply for a green card. Yeah, that's the whole... But what it really does, if you listen to the discussion, is that one of the logic behind describing this, one of the reasons used to support this is it gives them more opportunities to apply for an H-1B because of the limits on H-1B. But what it does is it puts more people into the pipeline applying for H-1B visas. So it's a net wash for the H-1B workers, but it keeps more people under the thumb of the employers for longer.
So, Dale.
What has happened over these many years with the other portion, the H-2 program?
They have had other lawsuits that have gone on with that as well. I have not been involved in one, but I do know that there have been fights over the wage requirements. Again, the Bush administration had lowered the wage requirements. There was a lawsuit. There have been a series of lawsuits that have been addressing that. I don't even think that's been fully resolved yet.
I follow on H-2B. There's legitimate temporary work assignments there, such as seasonal resorts and these kind of things. So very much different than the H-1B where you're sitting in an office building in Redmond or something. That's
There's probably a better justification, but even with the H1, even with the seasonal work, there's a problem, particularly when it regards the season. Because if I can see, for example, seasonal work during the winter as being hard to fill, but what about seasonal work during the summer when, in theory, the students are out to work? That's where you get. I could see a reasonably good argument for seasonal work wintertime, but then it kind of tends to fall apart for the summer.
But I know what they do is they have a requirement. They've got to go, they work a winter season somewhere and then they move elsewhere for the summer season inside the United States. So in a sense, it's maybe year-round, a little different than H-1B.
Could you comment on the diversity lottery? And could you also, comment on that one first, and I have one more.
On the diversity lottery. Well, I guess the comment on the diversity lottery, I have to comment on the Immigration Act of 1990, which I told you about, was the one that totally screwed up the immigration system. When we talk broken immigration, think Immigration Act of 1990. The diversity lottery, which was one of the creations of the Immigration Act of 1990, which gives green cards purely on a random basis to countries that don't supply a lot of where we don't get a lot of immigrants from. So every year they determine which countries are eligible, then people can enter this lottery and they get a green card, and there's no qualification whatsoever other than the lottery. So you're just handing random green cards out with no justification other than the country of origin. I'd also point out that another issue in the from that act that's in the news is the temporary protected status, that where it was temporary but has never ended until Trump.
Trump has rescinded those or not going to renew a number of those. In fact, on the news today, 90,000 from Honduras
Yep.
are going to have to go back. And I think there's over, I believe there's somewhere between what, 400,000 and 500,000, or is that low under TPS?
I don't even know the figures. I might, but
500,000. 500,000? Okay.
And NPR had a segment yesterday that this is causing a big problem to the SEIU and other unions that employ these TP workers. Isn't that amazing?
And it even says temporary, it's TPS,
temporary protected status.
But some have been here over 20 years due to like an earthquake or hurricane or that sort of thing.
But remember, these are people who entered the country illegally. Then they grant this temporary status that makes them legal, and it's supposed to be temporary and hasn't been. As we kind of, it just shows the fact that temporary status has been allowed to go on for 20 years. I mean, it just shows the total disregard there has been in the previous administrations towards any kind of rational immigration enforcement.
I have one last question. Is there, it looks like Leo has a question too. Just very quickly, is there someone in yours or Michelle Malton's sphere that can create a 90-second animated graphic explaining this?
Explaining what part of it?
The history and the process, and you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like a commercial, like a PSA.
Work with Dennis Prager.
Could we get something like that we can use to pollinate our people with?
Well, there are. You just have to pick.
Visual.
You just have to pick which issue to use.
Well, let's just take H-1B, for example, and what it's done. And I had another question, but I'll ask you later. But let's just pick that, for instance. Can we create a graphic, an animated graphic about that, but it's a visual?
It could be done out there. The big thing I would point out is the big point I would make on H-1B is: do we need a program whose purpose is to place Americans and foreign workers? And that's although that's not really
visual is huge.
Visual. And what you could do is for our presentation yesterday we had logos of companies that replaced Americans with H-1B workers. That's pretty graphical to show the number of companies that are doing this. So yes, it could be. And in some areas of immigration, like I know Numbers USA, which is a group that deals with immigration numbers. Roy Beck, who's the leader, had a good video on which uses gumballs to illustrate the population. So it can be done.
Would you be willing to consult on a production like that?
Yeah.
Okay. Theo's after.
Okay. One more question, then we are going to close this down.
So would you say that it is truly necessary to import more foreign workers, as in with the H-1B or H-1B1 visa program anymore? Because it seems that there's a lot of talk about education, how America is really low when it comes to education, but America's best of the best is the best of the best in the world. So there's a lot of kids out there who are, I think it was mentioned earlier that they're looking for work. I think only about 20% of the STEM majors are employed in their major of their specialty. So is there really a need to import more foreign workers when there's a big pool of American workers here?
No, not in general. And I would say that we'd be looking for people with special skills. When you asked that question, I was thinking about a physics experiment, a thought experiment. From entropy, where things naturally break down into disorder, and that's basic. If you just let things let things happen through entropy, we get chaos, which is what we have in the current immigration system. There's no thought going to it; it's just giant flow. But one way that's been theorized to defeat entropy is through knowledge. That if you have a little gate with a person sitting on top of it and balls going back and forth, the person with the gate can open and close the gate to only allow certain balls to get through and make choices. So if you use thought, to decide who's going to come to the United States, you can have a rational immigration system. You can have, pick, say, our national policy through immigration is to achieve something. We're not going to discuss here what that something is, but we can achieve something. But right now we have just a chaotic immigration system that doesn't that has no discernible policy whatsoever. Does that answer your question there? Kids care?
I believe so.
I believe so. I wish you could say definitely so.
Trump has called for immigration based on merit.
Yeah. And, maybe something to it. See, one of the simplifications, I'll give you one of the proposals I would have for the immigration, major change in the immigration system. I would make all guest worker visas strictly temporary. And then I would have one permanent residency visa that is in which the immigrant applies for it. So if a company wants a worker for a specific job, they get a guest worker and they know that they're going to have to go home. If a person's coming to this country, they can apply for a permanent residency, and they know that they're going to be able to stay. So that way that the potential immigrants control their own immigration policy, their own immigration process, rather than having that controlled by the employer. And so we could use factors like, does a person have a job offer in the United States? You could use that as a factor for a person applying. I'm applying for permanent residency. And I have a job offer, and these are my skills, and this is the kind of thing America's working for. You might even have family factors. I don't have a job, but I have close family members. That's a possible thing, but people are talking about diminishing that. And the other thing I would do is that you either get the permanent residency visa or you get denied. Right now we queue people, okay? And so these queues go on. So I'm asking, would say, have a simple system that where immigrants know where they stand, guest workers know where they stand, and so it would be easier on everyone. The problem is, who does that cut out? It cuts lawyers out. That's lawyers would fight to the death to prevent such a system from being implemented.
Right. On that note, he gave us some very specific examples of what he'd do. Let's give John a great time. Okay, in closing, it's about 9:15. I just want to recognize 4 people in this room. I know that's dangerous, but they either have been a city council person or a Sperry here, 2 terms, 8 years, City of Kenmore. I don't know if I'm supposed to say this. If I'm not, shut me up right now, but I think I'm looking at a candidate in the 45th Legislative District for the State Senate.